He gave food to 2 Apache sisters, and the next day, 700 warriors surrounded him. The sun had barely risen above the jagged horizon when he rode into the empty stretch of the desert. The land was quiet, almost too quiet, and the only sounds were the soft crunch of his horse's hooves on the dry, rocky soil and the distant cry of a hawk circling above. The heat of the day would soon come, but for now the air carried a crisp, dry chill. He shaded his eyes with one hand as he scanned the landscape, looking for signs of water or shelter. Traveling alone in these lands was never easy. Every step could bring danger, but it was a challenge he had grown used to. He had learned long ago that patience, caution, and respect for the land were the keys to survival. He had been traveling for days without seeing another human being. The towns and settlements were far behind him, and the familiar trails were long gone. His supplies were running low, and every meal had to be rationed carefully. Despite this, he kept moving, guided by a quiet determination and an unspoken understanding of the land. Each ridge, each rock formation, and each patch of desert brush was familiar to him now. Yet even in this familiarity, the wilderness could surprise a person, and he knew it. As he rounded a rocky outcrop, he noticed movement near a small, dry creek bed. Squinting against the rising sun, he saw 2 figures crouched on the ground. They were small, and from their movements it was clear they were children, or at least young teenagers. His heart tightened when he realized they were shaking and huddled together for warmth. He slowed his horse and observed them carefully. Their clothing was tattered, their skin covered in dust, and their hair hung in thin, unkempt strands. They looked weak, almost lifeless, and he could see that they had not eaten for days. He felt a tug in his chest, a mixture of concern and caution. Helping strangers in this part of the land was never a simple decision. He had heard stories, both true and exaggerated, about travelers being attacked by those they had tried to help. Yet, something in their eyes told him that they were in real need. There was no threat in the way they looked at him, no fear, only quiet desperation. Slowly he dismounted and approached them, keeping his hands visible to show he meant no harm. The sisters looked up at him, their eyes wide and wary. One of them clutched a small bundle of worn cloth to her chest, as if it contained all that she owned. The younger one's lips were cracked and dry, and her gaze flickered nervously between him and the distant horizon. He knelt a few steps away and spoke softly, though he did not know if they could understand him. "I have food," he said gently. "You must be hungry." For a long moment they did not move. He could see the doubt in their eyes, the hesitation, and perhaps the instinct to run. The desert had taught them to be careful with strangers, to trust no one too quickly. Yet hunger is a powerful force, and slowly the older sister stepped forward. He handed her a piece of dried meat and a small loaf of bread he had been saving for himself. She held it carefully, almost reverently, and then offered it to her younger sister. The 2 of them ate quietly, and he watched them, noting every small detail. The way they tore the food, the way their eyes lit up briefly with relief, and the way their shoulders relaxed ever so slightly. He could see that they were exhausted, not just from hunger, but from traveling through a land that offered little mercy. Their small frames were covered in scrapes and bruises, evidence of the challenges they had faced on their journey. As he waited, he scanned the surrounding area, mindful of potential danger. The desert was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. Every rock, every hill, and every shadow could conceal a threat. Yet at that moment the danger seemed distant, overshadowed by the simple act of giving. While they ate, he reached into his bag and offered them water. The older sister hesitated at first, then took the cup and drank slowly. The younger one followed her lead, and he watched as they quenched their thirst. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it felt monumental. The sisters had clearly been without proper food or water for a long time, and every sip seemed to restore a bit of life to their tired bodies. He wanted to ask them where they had come from, why they were alone, but words felt unnecessary. The desert had its own language, one of survival, observation, and patience. He decided to stay quiet, letting his presence speak instead. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a fragile connection formed through shared vulnerability. The sisters seemed to sense that he meant no harm, and in turn, he recognized the resilience in their eyes. Despite everything, they had survived. As the sun climbed higher, he offered them more food, rationed carefully so it would last until he could find a safer place for them. He noticed small details in their movements. The way the younger sister shivered despite the warmth, the way the older one kept glancing toward the distant hills, perhaps thinking of home or of safety. He realized that his help, though small, could make a real difference. A meal, a drink of water, and a moment of safety could restore not just strength, but hope. The desert stretched endlessly around them, a vast expanse of rock and sand, yet in that moment it felt smaller, as if the act of kindness had carved out a space of safety amid the harshness. He thought about the choices he had made to travel alone, the risks he had accepted, and the values he held. Helping these sisters was not about recognition or reward. It was about doing what was right in a world that often demanded otherwise. Time passed slowly. The sisters finished their meal, and he watched as they tucked what remained into their bundle. He could see gratitude in their eyes, quiet and understated, yet unmistakable. He offered them words of comfort, simple phrases they might understand, and tried to convey that they were not alone anymore. He could not promise them safety in the larger world, but for this moment, he could provide warmth, food, and reassurance. Before leaving, he gathered his things and prepared to continue his journey, knowing the desert would demand more of him. Yet, he cast one last glance at the sisters and felt a sense of quiet fulfillment. The bond formed in that brief encounter, through shared food and mutual understanding, was powerful. He had risked little more than his own comfort and time, but the impact on their lives could be immense. As he rode away, he reflected on the fragile beauty of human kindness. In a land of scarcity and danger, small gestures could carry extraordinary weight. The sisters remained behind, resting for the moment, nourished not only in body but in spirit. The desert continued its endless expanse, indifferent and vast, yet for those few moments, it had been transformed by compassion and courage. Even as he moved further into the wild, he carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter reminded him why he had chosen this path, why he continued to navigate the challenges of the wilderness. In a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving, he had found a simple truth. Acts of kindness, no matter how small, could create connections that endured beyond the immediate moment, shaping lives in ways that might never be fully known. And so the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the rugged terrain. The sisters, now stronger from the small meal and water, watched him disappear into the distance. Each step of his horse carried him forward, deeper into the desert. Yet the memory of the encounter remained vivid, a reminder of the unexpected bonds that could form even in the most unlikely places. The journey ahead was uncertain, the path difficult, but he knew that the simple act of giving had left an indelible mark on both his life and theirs, a story that would resonate far beyond the quiet desert morning. The morning air was cool, but there was an edge to it, a tension that seemed to whisper through the rocks and scrub. He had made his way down the dusty trail the day before, leaving the sisters with food and water, hoping they would have a safe moment to rest. Yet as he rose from his sparse camp and began gathering his few belongings, an uneasy feeling settled over him. Something in the desert had shifted. The wind carried not just dust but a subtle sense of movement in the distance, a rhythm he could not immediately place. He scanned the horizon carefully. The desert was wide and unforgiving, but it was also a storyteller, revealing messages in the patterns of sand and shadows. At first, he saw nothing, just the familiar jagged peaks and flat plains stretching endlessly. Yet there was a slight disturbance, a ripple in the mirage of heat rising from the rocks, a shadow that moved with purpose. He paused, hand resting on his rifle, eyes narrowing. The desert had taught him patience, and he knew that instincts mattered as much as careful observation. The memory of the sisters' faces from the day before returned to him. They had been so fragile, so vulnerable, and yet so resilient. He had risked little in offering them food, but he understood the delicate balance between kindness and danger. His decision to help them had been instinctive, moral, and necessary, but now he wondered if that small act had set something in motion. Perhaps the desert had noticed, or perhaps it was the people who lived here, the unseen eyes that watched the land with vigilance and caution. As he moved forward slowly, every step measured and deliberate, he began to notice subtle signs around him. A broken branch here, footprints in the soft earth there, evidence that he was being watched. The desert was vast, but the people who lived here knew it intimately. Scouts, warriors, or travelers, it was impossible to tell from afar. The footprints seemed fresh, and their direction suggested a movement toward the sisters' location. His heart pounded, not from fear alone, but from the knowledge that every choice he made now could have consequences. He considered turning back immediately, but something held him in place. Curiosity, responsibility, and a sense of honor combined, keeping him from fleeing. The sisters were counting on him, at least in spirit. They had placed their trust, however hesitant, in a stranger. Could he abandon them now? The thought made him pause and rethink his next move. He adjusted his pack, ensuring his provisions were secure, and readied himself for whatever might come. The wind carried voices faintly, not words he could understand, but the rhythm of many people moving in formation. It was unlike the scattered, chaotic sounds of random travelers. This was organized, deliberate. He crouched low behind a large boulder, using it as cover while observing the approach. His pulse quickened. He could see movement now, small dark figures moving in groups across the distant ridge. The sheer number of them was staggering. He counted at least dozens at first, and then more appeared, stretching across the horizon like a living wave. The desert seemed to hold its breath. The sense of anticipation was thick, pressing against his senses. Every sound, the crunch of rock underfoot, the whisper of wind across dry grass, was amplified. He realized that this was no ordinary encounter. This was a gathering of warriors, disciplined and purposeful. His mind raced, calculating distances, escape routes, and potential strategies. Yet he also understood that force alone would not define the outcome. Respect, honor, and perception mattered here. The images of the sisters' faces guided him. They had been helpless, hungry, and alone, and because of his simple act of feeding them, word had spread. In these lands, stories traveled faster than the wind, and actions were remembered, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes misunderstood. The sisters' gratitude had become a message carried across the desert. He realized that the approach of these figures was connected to his decision, but how it would play out remained uncertain. He crouched lower, letting his presence blend with the rocks. The warriors were coming closer, forming a semicircle as they moved with careful precision. Their numbers were far greater than he had imagined, hundreds, perhaps 700 strong. They were not chaotic or threatening in the immediate sense, but their presence was overwhelming, a living force that demanded attention and respect. He counted silently, estimating their strength, their formation, and their potential intentions. Time seemed to slow as he observed them. The desert sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the terrain. The heat began to rise, and with it, the tension. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, trained and focused on him, even though the distance was too great to see them individually. Every instinct he had honed over years in the wilderness told him to prepare, to consider escape, and yet he hesitated. He sensed that this was not a confrontation born of anger but a test, a moment where his actions would be judged. He thought back to the stories he had heard about the Apache people, their honor, their loyalty, and their strict code of conduct. They were fierce warriors, yet their actions were guided by principles that demanded respect for courage and generosity. He realized that his simple act of helping the sisters might be seen not as weakness, but as a sign of character. He adjusted his stance, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, careful not to provoke fear or misunderstanding. The warriors moved closer, and he could see the younger scouts now, closer to the sisters' location, seemingly verifying the story he had become part of. The desert was alive with movement, the rhythm of the group almost musical in its precision. Each step, each formation, spoke of discipline and intent. And yet, within that immense force, there was also an element of curiosity, a recognition that something unexpected had occurred here. He could feel the tension in his chest, a mix of anticipation, fear, and cautious optimism. He knew that this moment could end in confrontation or in understanding. He considered the lessons the desert had taught him: patience, observation, respect, and courage. All of these would matter now more than ever. He stayed low, but he allowed himself to be seen, signaling through his posture that he meant no harm. The wind shifted, carrying faint sounds from the warriors' direction. He could hear the beating of drums or perhaps the rhythm of coordinated footsteps, a signal that the group was organized, ready, yet not immediately hostile. The desert had become a stage, and he was the central figure in a story unfolding with both danger and possibility. The sisters, though not visible from his vantage point, were likely nearby, their lives intertwined with his own in ways that had only just begun to reveal themselves. As the hours passed, the warriors slowly formed a perimeter around the area. He counted silently, noting the arrangement and movements. Their formation was tight but not aggressive. It was a demonstration of power and attention, a way to assert presence without immediate conflict. He realized that their approach was as much about observation as it was about assessment. They were judging him, testing his intentions, and seeking to understand the story behind the stranger who had shown kindness. He considered every possible outcome, weighing options for communication, retreat, or defense. Yet he also knew that in this moment, his best tools were patience and understanding. Any rash movement could escalate the situation, but calm, measured behavior could demonstrate the very qualities that the warriors might respect. He adjusted his pack, prepared his supplies, and maintained a stance that conveyed both awareness and humility. The sun rose higher, and the desert seemed to hum with anticipation. Every movement of the warriors, every shift of sand beneath their feet, was a reminder of the fragile balance between survival and respect in this harsh land. He could feel their eyes on him, hundreds of unseen gazes, and he realized that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. Yet, through it all, he held fast to the principle that had guided him this far: to act with humanity, even in the face of uncertainty. The morning stretched on, and he remained vigilant, observing the perimeter, noting the movements, and preparing for whatever might come next. Each passing moment brought clarity. He was no longer just a lone traveler. He was a figure in a story larger than himself, a story shaped by acts of kindness, courage, and the unexpected consequences that followed. The sisters' presence, their reliance on his humanity, had set into motion a chain of events that would test him in ways he could not yet predict. And yet, even in the midst of tension, there was a quiet hope. The desert, harsh as it was, allowed for moments of connection, for acts of understanding and courage to shine through. He adjusted his stance again, allowing himself a brief breath of relief. The warriors had not attacked. They had not shown aggression. They were watching, yes, but there was an undercurrent of curiosity, of assessment, of recognition. Perhaps they could sense his intentions, the simple truth that he had acted from kindness rather than fear or weakness. As he settled in for the long wait, he reflected on the choices that had led him here. The decision to help the sisters, though small and seemingly inconsequential, had changed the course of his day, and perhaps more. He understood now that every action in this land carried weight, every gesture had meaning, and every encounter could become part of a larger story. The desert, vast and unforgiving, had provided a lesson once again, that courage, patience, and compassion were as necessary for survival as any weapon or skill. And so he waited, poised between caution and hope, aware that the day would bring a moment of reckoning. The desert continued its endless rhythm around him, the sun climbing steadily, casting long shadows and illuminating the intricate patterns of rocks and sand. The warriors moved silently within their formation, and he knew that soon, a moment would come when the story of the stranger who had fed the sisters would be revealed. Until then, he remained patient, alert, and ready for whatever the unfolding day might bring. By midday, the desert sun had climbed high, casting sharp shadows across the rocky terrain. The heat shimmered off the sand and stone, creating illusions of movement that made the land appear alive. He had been waiting for hours, crouched low behind the same boulder, alert to every sound and movement. His muscles were tense, every sense stretched to its limit, but he did not let fear take over. He had faced many dangers in these lands, and he knew that panic was a far worse enemy than any warrior. Slowly, the shapes on the distant ridge began to take form. The sunlight revealed more details, the glint of metal, the movement of feathers, and the unmistakable presence of figures on horseback. Hundreds of them. At first, it seemed impossible. 700 warriors were advancing toward him, forming a massive, organized force that swept across the desert like a wave. Their presence was commanding, yet there was a precision in their movement that suggested discipline, not chaos. He watched silently, absorbing every detail, knowing that understanding their formation could be his only chance of surviving this encounter. His heart pounded, not just from fear, but from awe. He had never seen such a large gathering of warriors in one place. Their numbers alone were intimidating, but their focus was even more striking. Every step, every movement was coordinated, and yet, he could sense that their intention was not immediately violent. They were assessing him, circling the area like predators sizing up their prey, but with an unmistakable respect woven into their cautious approach. He adjusted his stance, keeping low, making sure that every movement of his body communicated calm and respect. He reached for his rifle, not to prepare for attack, but to signal that he was aware and cautious. He had learned long ago that in the desert, knowledge of your surroundings and careful observation were far more valuable than brute strength. The warriors were approaching in waves, smaller groups merging into the larger formation. The rhythm of their movement was almost musical, a pattern that spoke of centuries of tradition and practice. As the warriors drew closer, he could begin to make out individual features. Their clothing was adorned with feathers, beads, and painted designs, each symbol carrying meaning and history. Some carried bows, some spears, and some held shields that glinted in the harsh sunlight. The horses beneath them were strong and agile, their riders skilled and confident. Even at a distance, he could sense the unity and loyalty among them, the invisible bond that tied such a large group together. Despite the overwhelming odds, he remained still, reminding himself of the simple truth that had guided him since he first saw the sisters. He had acted from kindness, not fear, and he hoped that this truth would be recognized. He thought back to the way the sisters had looked at him, the quiet gratitude in their eyes, and it gave him courage. Even here, surrounded by hundreds of warriors, he believed that integrity and honesty could speak louder than weapons. The warriors began to form a rough circle around his position, their numbers creating a living wall that seemed impenetrable. He could see scouts moving closer, their eyes scanning every corner, every rock, every shadow. They were cautious, not rash, and he realized that this was not just a test of strength, it was a test of character. Each scout, each warrior was evaluating him, looking for signs of threat, deception, or cowardice. He remained calm, letting his body language communicate respect and submission, careful not to appear aggressive. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The desert was alive with the rhythm of movement, the soft thud of hooves on sand, the rustle of clothing and gear, the faint murmur of voices carried on the wind. He remained crouched behind the boulder, aware of every subtle shift in the formation around him. The sun was now directly overhead, burning bright, yet he did not waver. He understood that any sudden move could provoke misunderstanding, and in a situation like this, misunderstanding could be fatal. He studied the formation carefully. The warriors had created a semicircle at first, then gradually expanded it into a near-complete enclosure. They had left a small opening, possibly a way for him to exit, but he sensed that leaving was not the intended solution. They wanted to communicate, to judge him, to understand why he had acted as he did the day before. The sisters' act of gratitude had sent ripples across the desert, and now he was in the center of its consequences. He thought about how the world worked in this part of the land. Word traveled fast, and actions were remembered. Even a small gesture could grow into a story that reached hundreds of ears in hours. By feeding the sisters, he had entered into a narrative larger than himself. He had become part of a story that demanded attention, and the warrior's presence was proof of that. He realized that he must remain steady, calm, and respectful, for his survival depended as much on his behavior as on his skill. The air was thick with tension. He could feel it pressing down on him, the weight of hundreds of eyes watching, evaluating, judging. Each movement of his own body was magnified, each breath measured. He considered the options: flee and risk attack, stand and hope for mercy, or attempt to communicate through gestures. He chose the latter, subtly raising his hands in a peaceful gesture, bowing his head slightly to show respect. It was a simple act, but in this culture it could speak volumes. As the warriors continued to close in, he noticed the sisters appear briefly on a ridge nearby. They were watching him, their small forms framed against the desert sky. Relief washed over him, mixed with anxiety. He hoped that their presence would help convey his intentions to the warriors. They had witnessed his act of kindness and were living proof of his honesty. The sisters' eyes met his for a brief moment, and he could see the silent message: "We are safe because of you. Please show them your heart." The formation around him shifted subtly, responding to unseen signals. He could see a leader, distinct from the others by his posture and the decoration of his clothing, moving forward. The leader's approach was deliberate, calm, and commanding. Every movement told a story of authority, respect, and wisdom. The warriors did not advance recklessly. They followed his guidance, maintaining the circle, keeping him in view without immediate aggression. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. His survival now depended not on speed or force, but on perception, honesty, and patience. He reminded himself that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act rightly in spite of it. He had acted out of kindness before, and he would continue to do so. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, he believed that integrity and respect could speak louder than any weapon. The leader drew closer, motioning for the scouts to pause. He noticed the subtle exchange of signals among the warriors, a silent communication that coordinated their movement. It was impressive, and he marveled at the discipline and training that allowed such a large group to act as one. The leader's gaze fixed on him, sharp and assessing, yet not cruel. There was a quality of understanding in his eyes, as if he was weighing the stranger's heart rather than his immediate power. The sun was now high and fierce, the desert radiating heat that made the rocks shimmer. He could feel sweat running down his back, but he remained still. The warriors, their horses stamping the earth, formed a living barrier that surrounded him completely. He was outnumbered, yet he did not feel hopeless. Something in the air suggested that this confrontation was not about violence. It was about understanding, about a test of character, and perhaps about honor. He glanced toward the sisters again. Their faces were calm, trusting him despite the danger. That trust gave him strength. He realized that his actions had consequences far beyond what he had imagined. By helping them, he had set in motion events that would now test his courage, judgment, and humanity. He did not flinch. He remained composed, his body language conveying respect and sincerity. The warriors began to adjust their formation, closing in slightly, not to attack, but to signal that the moment of reckoning was near. Every instinct told him to stay alert, to observe every movement, and to anticipate the leader's next step. Yet even in this tense situation, he could feel a sense of balance forming. The desert, the warriors, and the sisters had combined to create a situation where honesty and integrity could prevail over fear and force. Time passed slowly, each minute stretching into eternity. He remained focused, aware of every detail, every shift in movement, every silent command. He knew that the coming moments would determine the outcome, and he prepared himself mentally and emotionally. He would act with patience, courage, and humility. The lives of the sisters and perhaps his own depended on it. And then, finally, the leader stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. The circle tightened, and the desert seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set for the moment that would test not only his courage, but the power of kindness and respect in a land where every action carried weight. The eyes of 700 warriors were upon him, yet he remained steadfast, ready to face whatever judgment awaited him, with only the truth of his intentions as his shield. The air was thick with tension as the leader of the Apache warriors rode closer. His horse was steady, his posture upright and commanding. Even from a distance, the calm authority he carried was clear, and the stranger understood that every move, every word, and every gesture would now be under intense scrutiny. The warriors formed a vast circle, standing firm yet silent, their eyes sharp, watching, waiting. The desert seemed to grow quieter around them as if holding its breath, and the sun blazed overhead, casting harsh light on this pivotal moment. He remained crouched behind the boulder for a few moments longer, letting the weight of the situation settle in. His heart beat steadily, though adrenaline surged through his veins. He knew that panic would only make things worse, and that his behavior now would determine everything. The sisters, barely visible on a distant ridge, were watching silently. Their faces reflected hope, trust, and perhaps a shared understanding that his actions had set the course of the coming events. He took a deep breath, straightened his back slightly, and made himself fully visible. The leader approached, slowly and deliberately. His eyes scanned the stranger from head to toe, taking in his clothing, his posture, his hands, and the calm but attentive way he held himself. There was no haste, no aggression, only a careful assessment. The leader's presence was commanding, yet there was an unmistakable quality of patience in the way he moved. It was as if he was not just evaluating the man before him, but the choices that had led him to this moment. He knew that the leader's gaze was more than observation, it was understanding. The desert had taught him that actions mattered more than words, and here, in the midst of 700 warriors, that lesson was being tested. The simple act of feeding 2 starving sisters the day before had carried him into a situation far beyond anything he could have predicted. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, he felt a quiet confidence. He had acted with honesty, courage, and kindness, and now he could only hope that these qualities would be recognized. The leader stopped a short distance away, allowing the warriors to maintain their formation. He raised one hand slightly, a gesture that spoke of authority but also a willingness to communicate. The stranger responded instinctively, raising his own hands in a peaceful, respectful manner, bowing his head slightly. There was a silence that seemed to stretch for hours, yet only minutes had passed. The tension was electric, every observer aware that a single wrong move could ignite disaster. The leader's eyes flicked toward the sisters, who remained visible on the ridge. He nodded slightly, acknowledging their presence. The stranger realized that the leader understood the story, the act of kindness, the food, the water. The sisters were living proof of the stranger's intentions, and their safety was now intertwined with his own. The desert, which had seemed so harsh and unforgiving just days before, had become a stage for a profound test of character. Slowly, the leader motioned for a few warriors to approach. They moved carefully, silent but deliberate, circling the stranger without breaking formation. He noticed how disciplined they were, how every step seemed measured, as if each movement carried a deeper meaning. The warriors were assessing, not attacking. Their presence was overwhelming, yet there was a sense of order, a recognition of balance between power and restraint. The stranger remained still, aware that his every gesture mattered. He could not speak their language, but he could communicate through posture, through calmness, and through the honesty in his eyes. He lowered himself slightly, a gesture of respect, and allowed his body to convey what words could not. The desert, once vast and silent, now seemed to pulse with anticipation. The moment had arrived where his fate would be determined, not by weapons, but by character. The leader dismounted his horse, stepping carefully to the ground, and motioned for the stranger to remain where he was. The warriors shifted slightly, forming a tighter perimeter, but their movements were deliberate and controlled. There was no malice, only focus. The stranger felt a mix of fear and hope. He was outnumbered, yet he sensed that the outcome depended on the truth of his intentions and the sincerity of his actions. The leader's gaze was piercing. He studied the stranger with intensity, examining every detail. His eyes lingered on the stranger's hands, noting the absence of hidden weapons. He studied his expression, searching for signs of deception or fear. The stranger met his gaze steadily, understanding that honesty would speak louder than anything else. The desert had trained him for moments like this, teaching him to act with integrity even when the stakes were life and death. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The sun beat down, the air shimmered with heat, and yet the moment was suspended in stillness. The sisters watched silently, their faces showing hope but no fear. The desert, harsh as it was, had become a place where courage and kindness were about to be judged. The leader's eyes flicked briefly to the sisters, then back to the stranger, and he gave a subtle nod. It was not a signal of permission, but a recognition, a moment of understanding that the stranger had acted with pure intentions. The warriors shifted slightly, their horses moving in unison, creating a rhythm that was both intimidating and mesmerizing. 700 strong, they formed an unbroken wall of presence, yet there was no aggression in their stance. The stranger realized that he was witnessing not just power, but discipline, respect, and the weight of tradition. Each warrior was a piece of a greater whole, and the unity of the group amplified the leader's authority. The leader stepped closer, motioning with his hands for the stranger to remain calm. He spoke in a language the stranger did not understand, but his tone was measured and deliberate. The words carried authority, yet there was a gentleness, a recognition that the stranger had not come to harm. The stranger responded with subtle gestures, lowering his body slightly, keeping his hands visible and bowing his head in respect. The desert seemed to hold its breath, the silence profound, the moment sacred. Slowly the leader circled the stranger, moving with deliberate care, his eyes never leaving the stranger's face. Each movement was a test, a measure of patience and courage. The stranger understood that this was a ritual of assessment, a way for the leader to determine whether he was friend or foe. He remained steady, his breath calm, his eyes open and honest. Every instinct in his body told him to stay composed, to let his actions convey the truth of his intentions. The sisters, now slightly closer, watched the interaction with quiet fascination. Their trust in the stranger had remained unwavering, and their presence seemed to strengthen his resolve. He realized that he was not alone, that the simple act of kindness had created a bond that transcended fear and danger. The desert, once a place of isolation and harsh survival, had become a stage for a lesson in humanity, courage, and honor. The leader paused, facing the stranger fully, and held his gaze for a long moment. The sun shone down on them, casting long shadows across the rocks and sand. The stranger felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, yet he did not flinch. He understood that this was not a test of strength, but of character. He had acted with honesty and kindness, and now he awaited the judgment of the leader and the warriors who followed him. Finally, the leader nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that conveyed approval and understanding. The tension in the air began to lift slightly, replaced by a sense of acknowledgement. The warriors shifted, relaxing their formation just enough to indicate that immediate danger had passed. The stranger exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. He had been tested, and though the moment was far from over, the recognition of his intentions had been clear. The leader motioned for the sisters to approach, and they stepped forward cautiously. Their presence reinforced the truth of the stranger's actions. The desert, once a place of isolation and danger, had become a space of connection, understanding, and recognition. The stranger watched as the sisters moved closer, and he could see the gratitude and relief in their eyes. His act of kindness had created ripples that extended far beyond the simple meal and water he had given them. The warriors began to disperse slowly, maintaining a respectful distance while allowing the stranger to stand. The desert returned to its natural rhythm, the wind shifting, the sun blazing, and the silence broken by the soft sounds of horses moving and distant calls of birds. The stranger remained still for a moment, taking in the scene, understanding the magnitude of what had just occurred. He had faced overwhelming odds, yet integrity and courage had prevailed. The leader approached one final time, speaking again in his language. Though the stranger did not understand the words, the tone and gestures conveyed respect and acknowledgement. The desert, vast and harsh, had witnessed an extraordinary moment of human connection and understanding. The stranger had acted with honesty and courage, and the leader had recognized it. The sisters, now safe, remained a living testament to the power of kindness in a land that demanded vigilance and bravery. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the stranger reflected on the day's events. The desert had tested him, the warriors had assessed him, and he had endured. Through patience, courage, and respect, he had navigated a situation that could have ended in disaster. The bonds formed in that moment, though subtle, were profound. The sisters were safe, the warriors respected him, and he had learned yet again that even in the harshest lands, acts of kindness and integrity could shape outcomes in remarkable ways. The desert seemed to exhale as the last of the warriors slowly dispersed, returning to the distant ridges from which they had appeared. The air, once thick with tension, was now filled with a sense of quiet that was almost surreal. He remained standing in the center of the small clearing, his body tense but slowly relaxing, aware that the danger had passed, but also understanding that the weight of the encounter would remain with him for a long time. The sun was beginning its descent, painting the rocks and sand in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows that danced across the desert floor. The sisters approached cautiously, their small steps light against the hard ground. Their faces held expressions of relief and gratitude, and the stranger felt a warmth in his chest that eased the lingering tension. They stopped a few feet away from him, and for a moment, all three simply regarded each other. Words were not necessary. The silence carried meaning. The sister's presence was a reminder of why he had taken risks the day before, why he had chosen to act with kindness despite the uncertainty of the world around him. He knelt down slowly, maintaining a posture of respect, and gestured toward the small bundle of food he still carried. The older sister stepped forward, taking it with care, while the younger one watched with wide eyes. They did not speak, but their eyes conveyed a story of survival, hope, and trust. He nodded gently, acknowledging their courage and resilience. In that moment, he understood the profound impact of small acts. A simple meal, a cup of water, a gesture of humanity. These had not only saved lives but had forged a bond that transcended language, culture, and circumstance. The desert around them was vast, stretching endlessly in every direction, yet it felt intimate, as if it had witnessed something sacred. He stood slowly, brushing the dust from his clothes, and scanned the horizon. The warriors were gone, yet the lessons of the encounter remained. He realized that the desert was more than a landscape of survival. It was a place where courage, integrity, and compassion were tested, and where every choice had consequences beyond immediate perception. As the sisters began to move toward a nearby shaded area to rest, he followed at a respectful distance, ensuring they were safe. Their trust in him had remained unbroken, and he felt a quiet sense of responsibility. The desert could be unforgiving, and survival often depended on vigilance and cooperation. Yet here, in this brief moment, there was a reprieve, a chance to recover and reflect. He understood that their journey was far from over, and that the choices he had made had altered not just their path, but his own understanding of what it meant to navigate this harsh land. He thought back to the morning when he had first encountered the sisters, huddled and weak by the dry creek bed. The memory was vivid, their hesitant eyes, the careful way they accepted the food, and the subtle yet unmistakable relief that washed over them. That single act of kindness had set into motion events far beyond his imagination. It had brought him face to face with hundreds of warriors, tested his courage, and challenged his understanding of respect and honor. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds, the encounter had ended not in conflict but in recognition and understanding. The sisters settled under the sparse shade of a small tree, their movements careful but natural. He watched them for a moment, ensuring they were comfortable and safe, before sitting a short distance away. The silence was comforting now, a stark contrast to the tense anticipation of the earlier hours. He reflected on the nature of fear and courage, realizing that true bravery was not in confronting danger blindly, but in acting rightly despite uncertainty. His choices had been guided by compassion, and the desert had responded, presenting challenges that tested both his heart and his mind. As he rested, he noticed the subtle details of the environment around him. The way the sunlight played across the rocks, the distant flight of birds against the blue sky, and the soft rustle of wind through the sparse vegetation. The desert, in its vastness, seemed to hold a mirror to life itself, revealing lessons in patience, observation, and respect. He understood that every step he had taken, every decision he had made, had been part of a larger story, one that connected him to the land, to the sisters, and to the warriors who had observed him so closely. He considered the leader of the Apache warriors, whose assessment had been both thorough and fair. That single figure had embodied discipline, wisdom, and understanding, guiding hundreds with both authority and respect. The stranger marveled at the depth of their traditions, the way courage and integrity were measured, and the manner in which kindness could influence even those accustomed to strict codes of conduct. The encounter had been more than a test, it had been a lesson in the enduring power of human decency. The sisters, sensing his reflective state, offered a small smile, and he responded with a gentle nod. Their trust and gratitude were unmistakable, a silent acknowledgement of the connection formed through shared experience. He realized that this bond, forged in the crucible of need and compassion, would remain long after the desert sun had set and the shadows had lengthened. Acts of kindness, no matter how small, had the power to resonate far beyond their immediate effects, shaping relationships and understanding in ways that could not be measured. As the afternoon progressed, the desert began to cool slightly, and the golden hues of the sun softened. The stranger decided to help the sisters prepare a temporary shelter for the night. Using sparse branches and rocks, he constructed a simple barrier to provide shade and protection. The sisters assisted where they could, and together they created a small haven in the otherwise harsh landscape. This collaborative effort, though modest, strengthened their connection and allowed the sisters to feel a measure of safety. The act of creating shelter, like the earlier act of sharing food, symbolized cooperation, trust, and mutual respect. He reflected on the events of the day, understanding that life in the desert was a series of tests and opportunities. Moments of danger were inevitable, but so too were moments of connection, insight, and humanity. He had been confronted by 700 warriors, yet the outcome had been determined not by force, but by his character, his patience, and his integrity. The desert, in its impartial and enduring way, had witnessed a story of courage, kindness, and respect that would endure far longer than the immediate threat had lasted. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, shifting shadows across the sand, he guided the sisters in gathering water from a nearby small spring. Though modest, the water provided a vital resource, and the sisters drank deeply, replenishing strength lost from hunger and fatigue. He remained vigilant, aware that the desert could change suddenly, yet for the moment peace reigned. The simplicity of the act, water and shelter, underscored the profound importance of basic needs and the power of caring for others. The stranger watched as the sisters rested, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, and he felt a quiet satisfaction. His choices had mattered. His courage and kindness had carried him through a moment that could have ended in conflict, and had created a lasting impact on the lives of others. He realized that the true measure of bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act rightly despite it. The desert had taught him that lesson repeatedly, but today it had been tested to its fullest extent. As twilight approached, the sky painted with hues of pink, orange, and purple, he reflected on the lessons learned. The desert had shown him the value of patience, observation, and respect. The encounter with the warriors had demonstrated the power of character and integrity. And the simple act of feeding two sisters had revealed that kindness, even in small forms, could shape destinies and create bonds that transcended danger, distance, and difference. The sisters eventually fell asleep under the modest shelter, trusting that the stranger would remain nearby and vigilant. He sat quietly, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. The quiet was profound, a stark contrast to the tension of the earlier hours. The desert, which had tested him so severely, now offered a moment of reflection and peace. He understood that his journey was far from over, but that this encounter had shaped him in ways that would endure. He thought about the future, aware that the desert held countless challenges, yet also infinite opportunities for courage, compassion, and understanding. The encounter with the warriors had proven that integrity could withstand overwhelming odds, and that acts of kindness could resonate across cultures, forging connections that might never have been imagined. The sisters, sleeping peacefully nearby, were living proof of that truth. As the night deepened, he allowed himself a moment of gratitude. The desert, the sisters, and the warriors had all taught him something invaluable, that life's most profound lessons often emerged in moments of risk, humility, and human connection. The vast landscape, with its endless horizon and shifting shadows, had witnessed a story that would remain with him forever. Acts of courage, honesty and kindness had triumphed over fear and uncertainty, and the bonds formed in that extraordinary encounter would endure beyond the desert sun, and beyond the immediate trials of life. Finally, as the moon rose and bathed the desert in silver light, he settled near the shelter, keeping a watchful eye on the sisters while reflecting on the day's events. The desert was quiet, the danger gone, yet the lessons remained vivid and alive. He knew that he had been changed, that the story of this encounter would resonate within him forever, shaping the way he saw the world and the way he chose to act in it. In the vastness of the desert, amidst hardship and uncertainty, he had discovered a timeless truth, that even in the harshest conditions, humanity, courage, and kindness could shine with extraordinary power.